The following story is also available as a read-only version. Check the link in the description if you're interested. Of all the predators that roam this world, the blind huntsman is the most cunning. Clifford Curtis sat in a rusted sedan, sipping saccharine-sweetened Earl Grey from a thermos flask. On the highway, a river of red lights slowly flowed into the city, while a trickling stream of white lights came out of it. Strings of pale turquoise steam rose from the houses, high-rises and parks, coalescing into a hybrid mixture of fog and clouds hovering ominously overhead, sparkling faintly in the moonlight. It was from this embankment of haze that the blind huntsman would emerge. "Are you even listening to me?" Erasmus asked. The skull chattered his teeth as he spoke, an unnecessary sound generated solely to gain Clifford's attention. Erasmus was set inside a specialized compartment at the center of the dashboard, just above the radio, and secured with a strip of Velcro tape glued to his jaw. On his forehead, the shape of a crucifix was carved into the unusually white bone, painted gold with a silver rim. Two balls of obsidian rolled around freely in his eye sockets, the dots of light that represented pupils now focused on the man in the driver's seat. "Sorry, mate, I was lost in thought for a moment there," Clifford responded. "What was it you said?" "I said you should stop drinking so much tea, it'll make your teeth go yellow, and then some poor bastard will have to spend centuries inside a vessel with tainted headlights." Erasmus showed off his gleaming white biters. "Don't assume everyone's as vain as you, mate. You also might wish to focus on our task at hand," said Clifford, demonstratively taking another big gulp of his Earl Grey. "Oh, you mean like you're doing by getting lost in thought? Right now, the huntsman is up there, so save your introspection for when you need it. This type of lapse in attention could cost you your life on a night like this, and the way things stand right now, the Lord will not have mercy on your soul," the skull lectured. "Here we go again." Clifford rolled his eyes. "Oh, yes, we do. You regularly fornicate with married and unmarried women. You sleep in every day, regardless of whether or not you had the night shift. You never give anything to charity, and you haven't been inside a church for years." If Erasmus were capable of spitting, he might have. "All allegations for which you have no evidence, though I will freely admit that I don't attend Sunday service because I do not believe that God cares. Besides, it's easy for you to be a Puritan. I have bodily needs." In truth, Clifford was tired of having this argument every time they were out on duty, but it was a better way to pass the time than sitting in silence. "Descent at Sector 345, the dispatch woman's voice said over the radio. "No guarantees, but it's probably him." Clifford checked the coordinates against a map of the city to see where the huntsman was descending, then looked at the spot through his binoculars. Though there wasn't yet a vortex forming, he could see the tiny bolts of static electricity discharging around where it would appear. Without the binoculars, he would not have been able to see them, not only because of the distance, but simply because his human eyes could not see everything that was going on. "This is Sentinel-2, we have it. Driving over there now," Clifford spoke into the radio. "They're getting better at detecting it early," Erasmus commented. Both of his pupils had disappeared as he had fixed his gaze on the forming vortex. One of them rolled back, looking at Clifford. "We'll finish this conversation," the skull announced. "That's what you always say." Clifford turned the key and rolled onto the road. It was time to earn his living. The blind huntsman was about to come down on a quaint little neighborhood of family homes, differentiated only by minor details. One had windows with blue plastic frames, instead of the usual white, while another had the dark bricks around its entrance painted a lighter shade of brown than its neighbors. There were different fences, fountains, and cars parked in the driveways, but it was all superficial. Road signs were the only way to make sure one wasn't actually in an adjacent street. When they arrived, the vortex had become discernible, and the discharged lightning, had Clifford been able to perceive it, would have turned from a prickling mint green to a crescendo of bright orange. There was a convenience store at an intersection near the point of descent. Clifford decided to take a look inside, just to be sure. As expected, they sold everyday supplies, from candy bars to pencils to soulstones. Also as expected, they sold a wide selection of coffee, black tea, and other caffeinated drinks. Both the shelves and the refrigerators were very close to empty. "Exact pay or credit card only during night shift," said a sign right by the cash register. Nobody was manning it. The owner must have gone home very early. Instead of a human cashier, Clifford was greeted by a skull located in a secure cage right above a rack of glowing eggs and chewing gum. It was painted sky blue, with little dots of black and yellow around the eyes and mouth, and spoke with an androgynous voice that might have been a man's, a woman's, or even a child's. "You need to get your wares to the cash register if you want to buy them. I can't fetch them for ya," it said. The blue slits shimmering in its eye sockets narrowed. "Good evening to you as well," Clifford answered, flashing his gold-rimmed ID card. "May I see your sales records for tonight?" "No, but you may speak to them," said the skull. "At what time should I start?" Clifford frowned for a moment. They were supposed to have these in paper, but it might make the tedium of going through the books a tad easier. "Did you sell a higher volume of stimulants than usual today?" "I'm talking mainly caffeine, but also guarana powder and energy drinks." The skull's glowing eye slits lost contour for a moment, then returned into focus. "Now that you mention it, yes, we did sell a lot of that today," it said, a note of surprise in its voice. "You're supposed to report these things, especially on a night where the Huntsman's predicted to come out," Clifford complained. Had the office been unable to spot the point of descent as early as they did, the blind huntsman could have already been wreaking havoc on this neighborhood. People subconsciously preparing to avoid sleep was the best early warning system, but it required the public to cooperate. "Is the huntsman coming out tonight?" The skull sounded genuinely surprised. "Have you looked outside?" The skull's eyes became a bright red as its vision penetrated the walls of the store. "Oh," it finally said. "Well, me not sleeping means that I don't think about the blind huntsman all too much, to be honest." "That's no excuse. This is a massive public safety code violation. We could have proofed the neighborhood and set a trap. Now people are in danger," Clifford explained. It was always irritating to have to elucidate on these things to those who should know better. "Well, the affairs of people are hardly affairs of mine," the skull responded. "Now, are you here to bother me, or will you actually purchase something from the store? We are licensed resellers of chocolate, you know." "Do you really think someone who works for the office would go on duty without chocolate in his pocket?" Clifford was incredulous. "I thought you might have run out from all the hard work that you do. Now be gone, I have business to attend to." With that spiteful remark, the glow disappeared from the skull's eyes. Outside, the vortex was now almost fully formed. Clifford felt his limbs become heavy. His heart rate slowed as a deep calm spread through his body. It was time. The huntsman was about to emerge. He observed people turning off the lights in their homes as they were befallen by a sudden onset of tiredness, oblivious to the danger lurking above. It was always like this. Whenever the blind huntsman begins to manifest, people rest peacefully and forget about the danger. Clifford slouched against the sedan. It required all his strength to pull the door open and sit down in the driver's seat. The fabric was warm and comfortable, and it felt as though it were heated somehow. Strange. It wasn't like the office to have such a fancy feature installed. He blinked, leaned back, and got ready to sink into the soft embrace of sleep. "Come on, you amateur," a voice called out. "When the huntsman works fast, you need to work faster." Clifford recognized it as belonging to Erasmus, but wasn't quite certain of what he'd just said. It was time to sleep, not work. Work was tiresome. "Wake up!" Erasmus shouted. "Do not fall asleep. You will die." That startled Clifford somewhat. A dull surrogate of fear made him a little more aware of the situation. He was in his car, falling asleep. But he couldn't fall asleep. He was on duty. Sleeping on duty was dangerous. Lethargically, he raised his arm and opened a little compartment between the gearbox and the handbrake. He produced a small syringe filled with a milky grey substance, strained to uncap it, and plunged it into his arm. The injection happened almost on its own. Good. He was done. He could sleep now. Clifford jolted awake with a wheezing breath. He pulled the syringe out of his arm and hastily put on a plaster. That had been a close call. "Thank you, Lord, for protecting this fool," said Erasmus with genuine elation. "Thank you, O Lord, for he is not worthy of your favor." He needed a moment to clear his vision. A lethal amount of neurostimulants was coursing through his veins. On any other day, his heart would have exploded. Tonight, this injection gave him an hour of being awake in the blind huntsman's prowling grounds. "He's coming," said Erasmus, his eyes directed upwards. And indeed, peering through his binoculars, Clifford saw a snake of liquid shadow drag itself out of the vapor vortex above, becoming a streak of pure black writhing across the sky. It moved quickly, hovering, twisting, turning, and changing directions erratically. "Can you find a pattern?" asked Clifford, putting aside the binoculars. He could only see the fating vortex above them now. "No, but he does seem confused, I suppose," Erasmus responded. "I'm not sure why, but he hasn't honed in on anything yet. Oh wait, he's on the move." The skull's eyes followed the path of the blind huntsman. Clifford turned the key and started the car, following Erasmus' directions. It wasn't long until he came back to a halt. "Looks like he's found his first victim," the scowl said, "though he still seems a bit jittery. Be careful in there." Not waiting for his partner to elucidate, Clifford got out of the car and approached the house Erasmus had pointed him towards. It was a perfectly normal two-storied family home, with a red door, lace curtains, and a stone fountain. Using the skeleton key that every agent of the office possessed, he entered. Through his binoculars, he saw the black mass swirling above the head of a man in his mid-40s, who had fallen asleep at the living room table, his head lying on a stack of documents next to his laptop. Indeed, the huntsman was not behaving as usual. Instead of direct, methodical movements, he seemed hesitant, tentacles moving as though they were looking around. So long as Clifford wasn't asleep, the blind huntsman could not perceive him. However, he was about to make himself a lot more vulnerable. As the darkness enveloped the sleeping man, Clifford put away the binoculars and produced a small packet of chocolate from his breast pocket. He removed the star-spangled black wrapper, revealing a flat bar of ambergris-colored substance, dotted with black and white spots, like rice puffs. It split into two roughly thumb-sized pieces. Clifford placed one in the mouth of the sleeper and ingested the other one himself. The chocolate sizzled like sherbet powder in his mouth, and flowed down his gullet like a living thing that wanted to be consumed. After taking a breath, Clifford lied flat on his back next to the man. "Here we go," he said, and closed his eyes. He came to in a park. There were dogs crawling up trees with crimson leaves, jumping around in the branches like goats. The distant cityscape surrounding it was flat and poorly defined, like a set in a low-budget film. The dreamer was easy to spot. A grown man and a little boy at the same time, he was sitting in an octagonal sandbox, playing with wooden blocks. He was attempting to build a tower, but every time he tried to place the fourth block on top, it turned into a ball and rolled away, felling the entire edifice. Clifford brought the world around him into focus. He was not truly asleep. He could feel himself lying on the floor of the man's living room, and regretted not having taken the time to grab a pillow from the couch. The back of his head was already hurting. The blind huntsman would be more of a challenge. It could be any element of this dream until it chose to reveal itself, and at that point it would most likely be too late. Clifford approached the problem strategically, working outward from the elements closest to the dreamer, which were also the most stable ones. He peeled back the layers of the building blocks, lost his gaze in them. If the dreamer did this, he would change the dream, but not Clifford. He was merely a visitor here. There was a skull on one edge of the sandbox, staring with big, empty eye sockets. It was new, and he needed a moment to remember why it was there. Clifford pictured a golden crucifix on the skull's forehead, and big obsidian marbles for eyeballs. With much mental effort, the cranium changed in appearance until the transformation began happening on its own. Like an oil painting under a blow-dryer, the skull melted and formed a humanoid shape sitting in the sandbox. The dreamer seemed blissfully unaware of this process. Finally, a Teutonic knight, clad in full armor and with a winged helmet on his head, rose. Every wrinkle in his coat, every kink in his mail, and every bit of chipped-off paint was visible and well-defined, making him stand out against the fleeting nature of the dreamscape. "Took you long enough," Erasmus complained. "Have you found him yet?" "Yeah, he's in that rabbit over there," Clifford responded. Erasmus spun around, twirling his blade, only to pause. "There is no rabbit over there." He was quiet for a moment. "Ah, yes, humor. You ought to take this more seriously." "How could I, when the best example of how taking things seriously sucks the joy out of everyone's life is sitting on me dashboard?" Clifford continued his scan, analyzing the blocks, the sand, the little plastic excavator, even the planks of the sandbox. They were all what they appeared to be. The dreamer startled. Something had grabbed his attention, but Clifford could not see what it was yet. A young girl materialized out of nothing, sitting in a sandbox of her own. She was playing with a dollhouse bearing a striking similarity to the man's home. The dolls she was playing with appeared to be the dreamer and his family. Focusing on each individually, Clifford noted that, though their composition was different, more recent than the original elements of the dream, they were not the blind huntsman. The dreamer stepped out of his own sandbox to approach the girl, but slipped and fell several times on the short way there. Embarrassment filled the air, and laughter could be heard from an unseen group of children. The little girl ignored the dreamer. The ground around him oscillated between concrete, dirt, and grey bricks. "Are you having any ideas?" Clifford asked Erasmus. "I've never prided myself on creativity," the Teutonic knight responded. "But, judging from experience, the blind huntsman already knows you are here, so he will try to exhaust you by being patient. Let him try." The dreamer had entered the girl's sandbox and was trying to get her attention, only for her to turn away from him with deliberation and continue playing with his family. Clifford could feel him shouting incoherently, believing that he was making sense but in truth merely uttering sound. Finally, the girl took the doll that was supposed to represent him and threw it into his face, laughing. The ground of the dreamscape shook from the impact. Clifford almost fell over, but managed to catch himself at the last moment. They were in a different place now, a desert, and the dreamer was no longer a little boy, but a man-sized version of his own plastic doll. He was thirsty and in desperate need of drink, but the bottle of cool, refreshing water in his hand simply drained through his plastic joints. Mirages hovered over the sand all around them. They dissipated the moment Clifford tried to focus on them, and he couldn't even tell what they were supposed to represent. "Bloody hell," he complained. This was a perfect environment for the huntsman. "Clifford!" Erasmus shouted. "Over there!" The Teutonic knight was pointing at a tiny figure in the distance. It was a man on a camel, clad in black Tuareg garb. He had a rifle in his hands. It took only a moment of focus to determine it. This was the blind huntsman. The ground under Clifford's feet gave way, and before he knew it, he was waist-deep in quicksand. The dreamer was walking off, and the huntsman was riding their way. Clifford tried desperately to wriggle himself out of the pit, but the more he struggled, the deeper he sank, until eventually the quicksand was up to his chest. All he could do was damn the creators of children's cartoons that had made quicksand such an omnipresent obstacle, ingrained in the subconscious of so many people. He looked over to Erasmus, who seemed to be in a similar pickle. The blind huntsman passed them on his camel. Though his eyes were grey like those of a blind man, it looked at Clifford directly. A sardonic grin shaped its lips as the Tuareg rode past, approaching the dreamer from behind. It tapped the man on the shoulder, offering him a seat on the camel. Clifford began to shout, "No, don't do it! Run!" He knew it was pointless. The dreamer could hear neither him nor Erasmus. In a final act of desperation, Clifford tried to push himself out of the quicksand, grabbing handfuls of desert in the process. It only dragged him deeper into the pit, until the sand was right up to his neck. The dreamer smiled when the blind huntsman offered him a bottle of water that he could drink. The desert seemed less parched for a moment, the mysterious dunes almost inviting and full of promise. He jumped onto the back of the camel, thanking the rider for his kindness. It was the last thing he would ever do. The blind huntsman's torso turned around completely. Where once had been the face of a kindly old Tuareg was now a black maw tearing at the fringes of reality itself. The world shook as it sucked up parts of the dream around it. The dreamer screamed, but it was too late. Slowly at first, he was torn apart by the maw's suction. Like a black hole, it pulled in the dreamer fibre by fibre, until eventually it pulled him in all at once. The dreamscape shattered. Clifford woke up on the floor. The dreamer was having wild spasms in his chair, convulsing in agony, not making a sound. Blood was coming from his eyes, nose and ears, until suddenly all movement ceased and he fell out of his chair. He was dead. "Fuck," Clifford cursed. "Fuck, fuck, fuck!" It wasn't his first dead dreamer, not even his 50th. But he knew he would be agonizing over this one for months. Through his binoculars, he could see the blind huntsman hover above its victim for a moment before escaping through the back door, a snake of black smoke diffusing through the mosquito net. It was locked, and Clifford's skeleton key did not fit. He leaned back and kicked it open. There was no time to go any way but the direct way. Outside, the huntsman flew over the hedge and into an adjacent garden. Clifford grabbed a shovel and tore down an old piece of fencing. The rotted wood gave way easily, and he found himself in an area fashioned after a forest grove. All around him, fireflies danced in the moonlight. There was a young girl lying on the ground, her chest rising and falling with calm breaths. She looked happy, even as the blind huntsman entered her mind. Clifford took out another piece of chocolate, broke it, placed half in the girl's mouth, and lay down next to her. For a moment he thought that it somehow hadn't worked. He was still lying on the ground in this grove-styled garden. The fireflies were still dancing, but they were dancing in an unreal manner, forming complex patterns, flying in little colonnades, and sparkling in 1,000 colors. He heard the little girl laugh as she chased them. Clifford got to his feet and looked around. Though the surroundings of this dream were similar to the garden, this was actually a brightly illuminated forest, like one might find in a fairy tale. There was a castle on a hill far away in the distance, and a white stag with silver horns trotted around a nearby pond. Clifford focused on it immediately, trying to strip away the layers, but it was just that, a stag. He fell back into his usual pattern, identifying the different groups of fireflies as individual dream objects with a hierarchy. Those the dreamer was paying attention to were smaller, more detailed groups, while the ones in the background were just tiny dots of light. Clifford stumbled over a rock in the floor. It was a skull, and he repeated the process of materializing Erasmus in the dream. Once again, the sheer detail of the night seemed out of place somehow. "Ah, yes, the simple dreams of childhood," he said. "Can you imagine anything more beautiful than this?" "Maybe if there wasn't a monster in the woods, I would appreciate it more," Clifford responded. He'd gone over to focusing on the trees one by one, which, in a forest, was an exhausting task, but it proved to be a worthwhile one. As one of the trees became translucent under his gaze, Clifford spotted a figure behind it. It was a man dressed like a medieval forester, holding a hunting bow. A bandage covered his eyes. The blind huntsman reacted immediately, materializing an arrow in its hand and shooting at the girl with implacable speed and precision. The only thing Clifford could do was throw himself into the line of fire. He howled as the arrow penetrated his chest and bored through his lung. It was a sharp, burning sensation. Wood splinters dug through his flesh like razor-bladed maggots, and his breath was taken away. This was how the little girl imagined being shot by an arrow felt like. Better him than her, that was a fact. Even though Clifford would have phantom pains for a few days, his soul could only be heard in his own dream. This was not his own dream. "I will vanquish you in the name of the Lord!" Erasmus shouted as he charged. For a man wearing heavy armor, he moved with remarkable speed, brandishing his blade in holy self-righteousness. Instead of bracing for a fight, the blind huntsman simply sprinted up the tree and jumped into the sky, knocking another arrow aimed at the girl. That was the problem with children's dreams. Things that were often impossible in the more rigid minds of adults were very much realistic here. Clifford looked over to the dreamer. She had no idea what was going on, too lost in playing with her fireflies to care. Gritting his teeth, Clifford once again jumped between her and the blind huntsman's arrow. This time, it struck his abdomen, and though the pain was less sharp, it had a dull, hot quality to it that made it very distracting. The huntsman landed only a few meters away, knocking another arrow, but Clifford ran at it with his arms raised, dead set on tackling it. The arrow was let loose and pierced through Clifford's clavicle. It felt as though his torso was being split in two, a lightning strike of hot steel ripping him apart at the neck. Through the haze of white-hot pain, Clifford saw Erasmus once again charging toward the huntsman. Instead of taking another shot at the girl, it ran, whistled, and jumped onto the back of the white stag. The animal carried it away into the trees, where it disappeared into a distant mist. The battle was won, but the monster was not yet ejected. Erasmus was breathing heavily behind his visor. "I'd say the devil will have him, but he is the devil," he complained. The dreamscape changed. Beneath their feet, the ground shifted away, forming a funnel of grass around the hole right where the little girl was standing. Pumpkins began to rain from the sky as Clifford and Erasmus rolled toward the center. Their carved faces were evil and twisted, and they cackled like demons. Clifford tumbled through the hole, falling through a seemingly endless bank of black clouds. He lost sight of Erasmus as he spun, and when he looked back up, the Teutonic night was gone. Up ahead, the little girl was crying. Her dream had just turned into a nightmare. For Clifford, it was a relief. The changing of the dreamscape had removed the arrows stuck in his body. Though they left a painful aftertaste, he no longer felt like a pincushion. They came up hard on a bouncing castle. It was made of inflated rubber and plastic, even had the right color scheme, but was the size and shape of a real castle, or at least what the little girl believed a real castle to look like. She seemed momentarily surprised at the sudden reversal of her fate, but also curious at this new environment. Erasmus landed somewhere behind them, almost ripping through the fabric, but getting to his feet eventually. Clifford had no choice but to follow the girl and hope the night would not lose them. The great doors of the castle opened, revealing a warmly lit interior. A platoon of heavy chandeliers hung from the ceiling, swinging back and forth in unison. Servants in red uniforms all bowed before the dreamer as though she were the princess herself, and she seemed as surprised at this fact as anyone. The clangor of metal on stone behind them told Clifford that Erasmus had entered the castle proper. His first thought was that the knight had crossed the distance quickly by bouncing, but then he remembered that Erasmus was about as inventive as a pot of Earl Grey. He'd have to ask him later. Making sounds of delight, the little girl walked deeper into the castle, a mechanical bow going through the rows of servants like a wave as she passed them. A crystal stood at the end of the hall, at least 7 stories tall and glowing with the light of a hearth. It was the color of light ember. Clifford was so captivated by this that, for a moment, he didn't keep his eyes on the girl. Suddenly, she was gone, as though swallowed by the ground. "Fuck!" he shouted, looking around frantically, scanning the environment for clues as to where she could have gone. "Did you see where she went?" he asked, expecting a snappy retort from Erasmus. The knight said nothing. Clifford focused the spot where the dreamer had been standing just a moment ago, but it was real, solid, and impenetrable. How could she have disappeared like that? "Shit, fuck, shit, cunt," he murmured. He hadn't lost track of a dreamer in years. It was more coincidence than deliberation that Clifford turned around at exactly the right time to see Erasmus' sword come crashing down on him. He jumped back at the very last second, so that only the tip of the blade cut through his pectoral muscle. He understood the situation faster than he would have expected. Behind the Teutonic Knight's visor, instead of the usual faint outline of a nose and eyes, there was nothing but pure blackness. This was not Erasmus. This was the blind huntsman. Before Clifford could ask himself why the monster was attacking him, not the dreamer, the sword was rammed through his heart, and the huntsman moved his arm in an anatomically impossible jerk. He felt his body freeze, go limp, as his life force was drained into the blade. The knight's armor parted at the neck, revealing the blind huntsman's gargantuan maw. It had all been a game. There was no little girl, possibly no man in his house either. From the beginning, the trap had been laid for him. The blind huntsman was not usually one for personal feuds, but considering how often Clifford had cut short its fun in the past, he was not surprised that it had made an exception. He slipped off the sword. Clifford hit the ground, unable to move. "Foul creature! The Lord is with me!" Erasmus had tackled the blind huntsman just as it was about to consume Clifford. "You will perish at the tip of my blade, impostor!" The two knights were a whirlwind of metal. The singing and clanging of their blades was enough for a whole battlefield, so fast were their movements. Erasmus cut at the huntsman's shield with such force that he sent his opponent tumbling backward. He parried a retaliation blow with his shield, then went for a rapid stab at his enemy's neck. The sword pierced mail and gambeson like it was butter. "In the name of the Lord you are destroyed!" Erasmus roared. The blind huntsman turned into a maelstrom of darkness around the blade. His maw reappeared, but it was filamentous, weak, fading. The room was filled with an omnipresent, bone-chilling wail. It bored into Clifford's head like the cries of a million banshees. A white light filled the castle, too bright to see anything through it. "It is the will of the Lord that you be eternally banished to hell!" was the last Clifford heard before the light engulfed all. He awoke on the floor of the first dreamer's house. The man was dead. The huntsman truly had taken him. Groaning from the pain of his invisible wounds, Clifford rose to his feet and ran outside. There was a fire in his car, emanating from the dashboard. It was Erasmus. The skull was ablaze with holy flame. If you liked this story and would like to hear more, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel. A new short story is uploaded every Wednesday, and there will occasionally be another one in between if I find the time. Thank you very much for listening and have a great day.